Okay.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Archaeo Viking. Today I'm joined by fellow archaeologist Marc Barkman-Astles, and he's
Hello.
joined me to a day to address some very pertinent is so in the United States there are currently are myths about the Roman Empire that have come back to the forefront. They've always
Yeah.
existed, but now thanks to a certain billionaire
hmm
who very publicly made a Nazi salute on TV, uh, now they are back in the forefront,
Yeah.
especially revolving things around things like the Roman salute, which, to be fair, thanks to movies like Life of Brian, for example, the Roman
Yeah.
salute was popularized,
Yeah.
but never existed, and now his cronies are now saying that it does exist. And
Mm.
so I invite here because he's knows a lot about the Roman Empire, and he's a fellow archaeologist. And as he and I have talked about briefly, and he will talk about again. Um, in the past, he lives around in the northwest of England, around Hadrian's Wall.
hmm
So, of course, he knows a lot better than I on this subject. Now, to be fair, the United States does, oh boy, model itself a lot after the Roman Empire. I mean, just look at any building, any of our buildings in Washington D.C. and really any state capital. I mean,
Yeah.
I I was born in a city called Rome. Yes, Rome,
Oh, cool.
yeah, and um, there is in
Ciao,
Rome.
Bella.
There's actually a statue of Romulus and Remus and the wolf in front of the forum.
Cool.
So that's
Uh,
funny. Uh,
Mm.
we also have a city named Athens. So
That's cool. That's cool. So you made me breathe my coffee there. hmm
you gotta love the United States and emulating ancient Rome. So again,
Yeah.
there's a reason I'm having Mark on here to talk about this stuff because it is very pertinent.
Mm.
Um, so with that out of the way, Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and such that you've been doing over the past several couple of decades, I would assume.
Th- th-
Yeah,
Thankfully, it's it's not quite a couple of decades yet, but we're
yeah,
getting there. Um,
yeah.
yeah, so I'm an archaeologist. I live in the northeast of England, on Hadrian's Wall, in a town called Wallsend, originally from North Wales. But no matter where I've gone, both before and after I trained as an archaeologist, the Romans have been around. I used to live near a city
Mm,
called Chester, which literally just it comes from the Latin castra, meaning a castle. It's one of those boring possible names.
mm,
Compared to say Manchester or Silchester, just Chester. And then having moved to the northeast to study and then settle down, here in Wallsend, on Hadrian's Wall, I am surrounded by that Roman landscape. And technically speaking, I'm uh, about a mile north of the wall. So I'm sort of on the wrong side of the wall.
really?
Yeah,
So
at the moment.
you're in Caledonia essentially.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a woad trader here
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
north of Britain. But it's interesting how uh, I mean, there's so many different ways that you could tackle this question of Romans and how they affect modern psyche. I'll
Mhm,
suggest a couple of things though that you might want to jump off, you know, just riff off me if you
mhm,
want. So one of them would be here in the UK. Arguably, Hadrian's Wall is the biggest psychological barrier
mm,
that's ever influenced our history. People in the south of England and people who aren't paying too much attention to the map of Britain often think that
mm,
Hadrian's Wall is on the border of Scotland and England.
mm.
It's not. I'm a good 160 miles, I think, south of the border here. So it's
Yeah.
not the border, but it's were it not for the wall, arguably, you might not have developed some of the characteristics of modern Britain. So it's been influential without a doubt. The Victorians, of course, loved emulating the Romans, and
Yeah.
as you cannot help but see in the US, there's that sort of same fondness for empire, and the idea of almost
Mhm.
inheriting a dare I say it, a civilizing mandate that the Romans liked to pretend that they had.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yes. which also can be seen, and this is also very connected to the United States, could also be seen in the Spanish Empire's doctrine of discovery, and also by
Mm.
argue by proxy. I, I don't remember if the British or French Empire ever had a quote unquote doctrine of discovery, but they sort of used the Spanish Empire's doctrine of
Mm.
discovery
Mm.
is an example for their actions. The French a little less because the French were um,
Yeah. Well,
not as
I,
heavily in the Americas as Britain and Spain were, but you know.
yeah, I think here there tends to be talk of an age of exploration, and there's often certainly a post 1950s playing down of an age of imperial expansionism. Um,
Yeah.
it's much more likely to be about, oh, we went and explored and found interesting places, not we went and insisted that people buy our drugs, for example. So
Yeah,
it's all
yeah,
about,
not, yeah.
yeah, it's all about perspective and how how you're playing it out. But what's interesting though is that this idea of empire being a civilizing factor is something that we first in Victorian era Britain, certainly in the aristocracy, we first sort of imagined had to happen to us. There's a picture. I'll send you a link to it. There's a picture. There's a
Mhm,
huge mural on a wall in a great house here in the northeast. Um,
mhm,
and it's one of several friezes that depict different periods of history in the
mhm.
region, ending with the last one is in the Victorian era ish, and saying, we taught the world how to build ships of steel, this kind of thing,
Yeah.
industrial revolution, this kind of thing. But when it comes to the Romans, what's interesting is it doesn't depict us as the Romans. It depicts us as there's a couple. There's presumably a husband and wife who have been sort of toppled, and they're sort of looking up at this shining Roman man as Hadrian's Wall
Mhm,
is being built in the background. She is wearing garb directly inspired by Native American dress, this native
uh-huh,
Britain. And it's almost as though we imagine that we were civilized so that we could civilize. That was sort of
mhm.
what was internalized, the better part of 200 years ago, and then became that sort of impetus for expansion and exploration, I think. Yeah, it's
Mm,
an interesting one.
yeah, and I would definitely agree, especially in reference to the United States, which I have said in the past and continue to say, despite what a lot of Americans and also a lot of Europeans would like to believe, the
Hmm.
United States is very much a in a lot of ways a European country, especially when it comes to, the predominantly white Anglo and white
Hmm.
German and etc.
Hmm.
Majority. I mean, of course, it is its own thing and in the Americas, but it's a direct offshoot of the British Empire, and
Yeah, well, and certainly, arguably, I suppose what we're seeing at the moment, and what we've been seeing probably
mhm,
for quite a lot of yours and my lifetime,
mhm,
is a reaction of that part of the American experiment to
yeah,
any sense of change and influence
mhm,
shifting.
yeah,
So in that sense, yeah, I definitely recognize what you're saying, and then as you say,
yeah.
it runs through architecture, it runs through the legal system,
Mhm.
it runs
Well, and
through.
then the whole idea of civilizing, because like we have in America we had and still arguably have
Hmm.
manifest destiny, which was the
Mm,
idea that the United States was divinely destined to quote unquote settle, conquer, and colonize, but settle,
but of course, separation of church and state as well, naturally.
yeah, which of course is very well. I mean, is very similar to some of the other things that popped up after the Revolution of 1688, the Glorious Revolution.
Hmm. Hmm.
But
Hmm.
yeah, but like the whole idea of unifying and civilizing the Native Americans, because
Mm,
like I just did a video on my YouTube about the uh United States colonization of the Pacific Northwest, which is where Oregon and the states of Oregon and Washington
mm,
and such are. And one of the things is like white American missionaries went there first and they're like, we're like, we have to say this, we have to convert the Native Americans because we need to bring civilization here. In order to bring
Mm,
civilization to them, they have to be Christian, and it's a whole thing.
yeah.
And then um, the I guess the symbol of Manifest Destiny was a uh, individual known as Columbia, which is very much a
Mm,
Roman sort of esque name,
mm.
and of course we have
So,
depictions
and is that
of
is that is
the.
that referencing Columbus coming to the New World? Is that it? And growing out of that?
I would have to think. I would have to look into that. Columbia is her own thing.
Right.
She's like again a symbol. I mean, because I guess you could argue like because there's also like Colombia, like the country, which at one point in time was called Grand Colom,
Mm,
which was
mm,
a unified nation after Bolivar, Simon Bolivar, and other revolutionaries pushed the Spanish Empire out of there. But it's Manifest Destiny is a complicated thing. It's got so
mhm,
much Christian, you know, stuff mixed in it. But it's still very much a result of this idea of exploring because we have a similar thing. Oh, the
mm,
United States, we just went out and explored. It was the rugged mountain man and the rugged pioneer. We went out and it's like, okay, but we also disenfranchised and committed genocide against, entire Native American nations. And
mm,
we uh, uh, participated in the transatlantic slave trade and, disenfranchised millions of Africans from Africa and then eventually
mm,
African Americans and such. But it's very much a part of that whole idea of exploration, and of course that comes from the fact that the founders of the United States were wealthy British aristocrats, and up until a certain point, they always thought of themselves as British
mm,
aristocrats, which is a problem that people in the United States have, is they don't want to, in the United States, you hear, "Oh, Paul Revere, the British are coming, the British are coming," when most
mhm.
historians are like, "Okay, well, at the time we would have actually been British. That would have been
The
kind of like,
redcoats. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
well, it would have been more like the regulars, but yeah. So
The regulars. Yeah, okay, yeah. Well,
yeah.
but it's actually funnily enough, I live just across the river from Washington, so where George's family was from.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah. If you actually drive into Washington, on the sign they have the Washington family
Mm,
crest as their town insignia. And visited the house, and it's filled with, oddly enough, copies of the Declaration of Independence. So people have to sort of right. It's weird. It's a weird combination of things. Um, but it's especially given that the house, obviously, his family wasn't really there. He never saw that house. I don't believe in his lifetime.
no, he didn't.
No, but it's interesting that there's this sense that somehow exploration and conquering, whether through destiny or after the fact by virtue of simply turning up somewhere and out competing people, depending on how you want to try and
Mm,
disguise your motivations, isn't necessarily something that actually the Romans pursued. What's
mm,
interesting is that the Romans, when you look at the Romans, there are a few things that need to be understood. The first one is that expansion into the rest of Europe, into Gaul, eventually into Britain, came primarily through a desire to make money.
mm,
So Caesar himself, um, Caesar Augustus, who ended a decades-long period, well, just over a century, I think, long period of civil war where wealthy
mm,
people were fighting over basically becoming proto-emperors. He brought this
mm,
to an end more or less by having the gall, if you forgive the pun, to go
mm,
into what is now France, and just start waging war and taking slaves, taking mineral wealth, and also as well taking fame. He was writing back to the people in Italy, well, sorry, in Rome, um, and the surrounding area, to sort of give this sense, almost like an explorer, as we might recognize from the Victorian period, going into deepest darkest Africa or something,
yeah.
and exaggerating their adventures somewhat. He
Mm,
was writing to also increase his own standing. There wasn't really a desire to own land or territory. That came after the fact. Eventually,
yeah.
bit by bit, once that had been established as a norm, and particularly when the Roman Empire, and incidentally, they never actually had a word for empire, which is interesting as well. But when
Yeah.
when what we call the empire was running out of mineral wealth and money, then they would seek expansion. So, for example, into what is now Romania, Trajan oversaw that
Hmm.
centuries later.
Yeah. And to
Um,
Dacia, I believe is the correct
yeah, yeah,
pronunciation.
or Dacia, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
so going into these places primarily for the most part was about about expansion economically and bringing that wealth back to Rome. Um, because in that sense, expansion was always a burden, and it always led to more people coming to the city, Rome itself.
Hmm.
Have you ever heard of the term the dole? So when someone's on the dole,
No, I have not
no.
actually.
So here in Britain, if you're on welfare, perhaps you might say,
Hmm.
if you're seeking a job and you need the state's help, then you can, depending on how much national
Hmm.
insurance you've paid, you can draw some money out, a very nominal amount just to keep you going. Um,
Hmm.
and we used to call that the dole, and we still do actually. It's
Okay.
the slang is the dole, but it comes from a Roman practice of having basic rations in the city of Rome
Oh.
when there were times of strife or times of famine, particularly, for example, in Egypt. So expansion
Hmm.
in that case was driven into places like North Africa and the Levant because of the need to feed the city, this urban
Hmm.
environment that was actually quite dirty and relatively unhealthy. The average height of a Roman, for example, was shorter than it was in the rest of Europe because of that
Hmm.
urban environment. Um,
Hmm.
but again, the expansion wasn't territorial; it was primarily economic. So,
Yeah.
so it's interesting how that was developed and was, you might argue, built upon and or twisted throughout the centuries that followed. Um, but something just getting down to really basic things, like if you, and obviously we can touch on
Hmm.
connections with fascism and Elon Musk in a
Yeah.
moment, but really
Yeah.
basic things is that I always like to point out. This is in primary schools. If I'm doing like a lecture, if I'm doing like a workshop in a primary school, one of my
Yeah.
favorite things to point out is just how weird Romans were. Because we tend to
Yeah.
think of Romans as being like, as it were, like modern people. They have an economic system, they did bathing, they had roads, they had a legal system, all this stuff that we think of as being markers of civilization. But actually, Roman culture was strange. Within the family, um, the father had the power of life and death over his children, for example. It's similar to what you might think of as being honor killings today. It was the weight of the ancestors within the cult of the family.
Hmm.
He was the head priest, and that responsibility to not dishonor the family, to continue the name in a way
Hmm.
that was aspirational and at the very least didn't get worse, was so strong that without legal any legal repercussions and without any defense, in fact, from his children, he could put them to death. That's not a modern Western value. That's not as Musk might say, a
No.
Western civilized value. Um,
No.
you also had things as well with the Romans of uh, yes, actually, interestingly enough, you could buy and sell people, but slavery wasn't based on what came out of the
Mm.
transatlantic slave trade. It wasn't.
Yeah.
You couldn't look at someone and say that's a slave or not. What mattered was your citizenship, a little bit like in ancient Egypt
Yeah.
as well. And so,
Yeah.
if you
I'm
had a
glad you're
state,
touching on this because I was
oh,
gonna bring that up at some
oh,
point.
okay,
So
there you go.
because
Well,
that is a thing that a lot of uh I'll let you get back to that in a second, but there's a thing that a lot of people in the United States uh
yeah,
try to argue like, well, slavery existed everywhere. Another
mm,
like thing they point to is like the Ottoman corsairs, when it's just like, okay, yeah, but that's not the same thing. Like you could get your freedom for the right amount of money. That's not the same thing as
no, no,
African chattel slavery.
no,
Yeah.
and you and and there was no great effort by the Romans to prove
Hmm.
that people who had been slaves were inferior humans. They were simply
Hmm.
socially inferior and they were property. So you could do horrendous things to a slave, but that slave could earn their freedom, but also more to the point, they weren't just from certain places. They didn't look certain ways. It's interesting though how
Mhm.
in Hollywood movies often that is still color coded. So if you look
Mhm.
at
Yeah.
Ridley Scott's
Yeah.
movies,
Gladiator.
actually in general,
Yeah.
Gladiator, Gods and Kings,
Yeah.
Exodus, that one. Uh,
Yeah.
Wealthier people tend to be paler, darker people tend to
Yeah.
be slaves, which actually leads to, I think, really um, unfortunate modern point scoring. So, in the case of Denzel Washington turning up in Gladiator 2,
Yeah.
he's clearly quite excited as an actor about being uh, a man of African American origin, playing someone who has power in the Roman world. Uh,
Yeah.
and yet, actually, that's not necessarily unusual. What's interesting
Yeah.
there is it's not in, but I think it's a modern film, and in that sense, you could argue that it's a vehicle for talking about modern problems.
Well, but it is
Um,
also a thing that, like, people in the U.S. complain about because in the U.S. so woke, et
mm,
cetera, et cetera. And
mm,
also, unfortunately, it's not a thing that's just in the U.S. It's I've had conversations with people in Europe who
mm.
have very horrible ideas, and some of them, even when they're not that bad, there's a particular YouTube personality um,
I think I know who you mean. Yep.
yeah, and he's made multiple things about, like, when he's like, oh, like this Roman emperor who visited Hadrian's Wall, he saw a black guy and said, oh, it was the color of a bad omen or something like that, and that's
Yeah.
why racism existed in the Roman Empire and such, and
Mm.
you know, and I'm not going to name him because, and it's not because I'm afraid of retaliation, because
He's got
I
amazing
just don't
hair though. To
care.
be fair, he's got wonderful
Yeah,
hair.
he's got amazing hair. It's just I just don't care, and he's like his arguments are old and stale, and they have no substance behind them. But he's argued stuff like that before too, and his whole thing is similar to the United States, to us in the United
Mm.
States. People saying, "Oh, it's woke," and it's just like, but that's not it. I mean, I've been told by people in Europe when I brought up, like, okay, but like the Spain, the Emirate of Cordoba and the Moors,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
Scythians, the Huns, etc., in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Some Sarmatians were brought to England as part
Mm.
of garrisons by Marcus Aurelius and a couple of other emperors, and they're
Yeah.
all like, oh yeah, but you can see in the shape of their eyes that they've been, they're not pure
Well,
European. As just
Well,
yeah,
at that point, actually, the line starts to retreat.
yeah,
So
yeah,
so I've had some very similar conversations where people will be at great pains to talk about how, okay, so maybe some
yeah,
people from Africa came to medieval Britain, for example, but it was
yeah,
no one south of the Sahara. It's always no sub-Saharans, this kind of thing.
yeah,
It's and that there is a desperation there and a desire to
yeah,
sort of neatly compartmentalize people in a way that basically means that moving and mixing, for want of a better word,
mhm,
is a new phenomenon when it's absolutely not, and
yeah.
it never has
No,
been.
it's not.
Um, but that, just going back to that thing
Yeah,
about people and owning people, is that one of the things that's interesting is that um, uh, they didn't, as far as we can tell, reach a point even after the Christian religion was not being persecuted. They didn't reach a
hmm
point at which slavery was seen to be, as for example, some founding fathers in the U.S. even acknowledged it as a blot upon the society. So
hmm
they didn't reach that intellectual level of saying it's wrong to own people, whereas
hmm
actually, the Enlightenment did. So if you want to give points, then you can give points to the US and Europe on that front. But that said, though, the big issue when it comes to owning people is that the Romans never turned it into such a cynical and industrialized process. Um,
hmm
and if you this is one of the things that I find fascinating, talking to other people in Britain who just want to say, can't we just let it go? Um, is if you look at things like the slave colony,
hmm
basically, that was set up in Jamaica,
Yeah.
the most brutal thing that possibly people have ever done to other people en masse. Um,
hmm
and and they still live with it today. There's a reason why Jamaica is talking about reparations,
Yeah.
because there's a direct connection there. And the reason why I'm focusing on slavery is that, yeah, you can make the
Yeah.
argument that it's always been the case, sure, but we, you and I, haven't directly benefited from Roman slavery.
No. No.
We have and do directly benefit from the transatlantic slave trade.
Yep.
You know,
Um.
in terms of industrial processes that were funded by cotton, for example, and so on and so
Yep.
forth. Now, that's not to say that we need to feel guilty for it. I have never
No, but
owned
we need to
someone.
acknowledge it.
We
Yeah.
need to acknowledge it, yeah, and
Yeah.
we need to understand that legacy is something to be responsible for. And in the same way that you might want to be proud of, for example, Roman connections, and you
Mm-hmm.
certainly, for example, in the US or here in the UK, want to be proud of age of exploration or figures like Churchill and Roosevelt and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
You also need to bring with them what made that power and wealth possible. You know,
Yeah.
and so I think it's interesting when we start talking about Romans and slaves, just to sort of acknowledge that the slave trade is very specific. The transatlantic slave trade, that is to say, is very specific, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not nearly as pithy an argument as people think it is to say, you know,
No.
all empires have had slaves. You know, it's not, it
Yeah.
wasn't the
And
same.
another argument that I hear all the time is, like, oh, the Vikings had slaves. And again, it's like,
Yeah, the
it's
Slavs
not the well, in other groups, that
and
they would
others.
like
Yeah,
race
yeah,
from England, but it's like, but again, it's not the same. They could earn their freedom and eventually pay for their freedom. Which, to be fair, you could theoretically do that in the United States with African chattel slavery. However, it was much more difficult, and there have been
yeah.
times where people paid for their freedom, and then like it was sort of like, ha, you take
It's
that,
obviously
see, then you're not actually getting your freedom, kind of
yeah,
thing.
but then also as well, you'd have indentured servitude, or you'd be
Yeah,
working in a
yeah,
situation where essentially all of your earnings were going back into the economy of that estate because all the stuff you were buying
exactly.
was being sold by them. And crucially though, excuse me, the thing that really matters there is that there was no great effort by the Roman
Yeah.
writers or scientists or poets to say this group of people are inferior to us
Hmm.
in order to justify slavery,
Yeah.
or to justify colonial holdings. I mean,
Hmm.
there was sort of mythology around Britain, to sort of to
Hmm.
justify Britannia as a colony in that sense. You had Romans being, of course, they were vexed by people like Boudicca. They were
Uh,
astonished by the fact that men and women wore trousers, for example.
yeah.
Certainly early contact times. But I think the other thing to bear in mind about the Romans is that they're not static. So
No.
we're talking about centuries of humanity, longer, for example, than of course the United States has existed as an entity.
Yeah.
And no one, hopefully, no one will look back in time and think that you, for example, today should be expected to dress like Abraham Lincoln dressed,
Yeah.
or for
Yeah.
example, that I should be expected to dress like Henry Tudor. These
Yeah.
things,
Exactly.
fashions change, awareness changes, technology changes, and what a Roman looked like and behaved like, and let's just say, sorry, a Roman
Hmm.
citizen looked like and behaved like across the empire changed dramatically over time, and
Yeah.
so we have this tendency to think of Rome as this sort of this marble city, when actually that came
Hmm.
relatively late. Um, Augustus, for example, that is to say, um, Julius, no, not sorry, I might have misnamed him earlier. Julius Caesar, his adopted son, Caesar Augustus, um, uh, began the
Hmm.
process of enmarbling Rome, as it were, bringing in marble
Hmm.
statues from Greece and making public nudes of statues more acceptable to the Roman mind. Um, but really, it was a muddy city. But one of the best depictions of this. Have you ever seen the TV series Rome, HBO BBC
Yeah.
co-production? Yeah,
Yeah.
that you never see it as a marble city there. There's a couple of buildings are sort of marble-esque maybe, but it's
Hmm.
brown, it's red, it's clay bricks, it's roof tiles.
Yeah.
It's and one of the things is funnily enough that got the series shut down was the fact that the public were watching it and lots of people were reviewing it, saying, "Where is the Marble City? Where is the city
Yeah,
of those great epics from the 1950s? Those again Hollywood images,
yeah,
where people where
like Spartacus with,
yeah, Ben Hur,
yeah,
yeah, exactly.
exactly,
Um,
yeah,
and yet that we weren't looking at that period in Rome's history. And it's interesting
mm,
that this sort of squashing together, this truncation of an idea, then gets mapped onto what people tend to think
yeah,
of as images of power, which clearly
mm.
leads into your man throwing his arm up at the inauguration.
Well, yeah, and not only is just that, another common myth that like images
Mm,
of power, another common myth that you see in so many movies involving about Rome, whether they are, with a few exceptions, but whether they are like, um, like for example, Spartacus with Kirk Douglas, or
mm,
Ben-Hur, or Gladiator, or any number of things, or the miniseries about Julius Caesar conquering Gaul,
mm, mm,
Druids. It's all based around this idea that Rome was invincible. Rome was this unstoppable war machine that could,
mm,
which is not completely untrue. They definitely were not, slouches, but they
mm,
also like definitely were not uh invincible. Like one of my favorite ones is, talking about wanting more money. Marcus Crassus, finding out Julius Caesar and Pompey were becoming more popular than he was, like, I'm going to take an army and invade Parthia, and then
mm,
get, so I can get money, and then gets absolutely massacred, literally by the Parthian cavalry.
yeah.
And it's like,
And
and,
so in that
and
sense, it's posh
yeah,
boys with money problems.
yeah,
That's basically,
yeah,
and it's but it's also interesting that that you have this situation where uh, where people enjoy, I guess, hearing these great stories. They have also been
mhm,
mythologized. So in that sense,
yeah,
I guess we're not just talking about history, are we? We're also talking about a legend, I guess, a
mythology, yeah,
legend
yeah.
of Western civilization.
Mm,
Um, Arguably, though, and I guess you will presumably feel similarly, that the word civilization itself is one that, as with so many other words, culture, for example,
mm,
is given weird weight in the modern
mhm,
world, as though civilization is a certain
yeah.
point, and it's held by certain people.
Yep,
Um,
I've made that
yeah.
argument
Mm,
many a times, because I'm just like, okay, well, how do we? One of my arguments is like, well, how do we quantify civilized? I mean,
mm,
because you know, most certainly, for example, the Native American nations of the Great Plains were a civilization. They were
mm,
civilized. We like to claim, like in the United States and in movies, especially movies from the, you know, 40s through the 70s, like to act like they weren't, but they were. Or the various steppe cultures, like the nomadic horse cultures
mm,
of the Eurasian steppe, like the Scythians, the Huns, the Sarmatians,
mm,
etc. They were civilized. And again, ancient Rome would like to claim they weren't. Ancient Rome and also the Greeks,
mm,
like
mm.
to, like, for example, Tacitus, and Julius Caesar. There's all kinds of what we would call noble savage tropes, in their stuff,
Yeah,
involving, the Germans, the Germanic tribes, and the Gauls and such. But they were
but
still civilized,
yeah,
you
and also
know.
but also as well, they often were used in rhetorical ways that weren't
Yeah,
that didn't reflect even what Romans knew to be true.
yeah,
If you look at the massacre at Teutoburg Forest, for example,
yeah.
happened on my birthday. Uh,
Oh, really?
I've forgotten what year it was now. It was early in the first century, and
Uh,
it was the result of having brought in a, a high-ranking local,
yeah.
Germanic local, to live
Mm,
in Rome initially, I believe, then train as a military leader, and then sort of retire and go home. And he was
mm,
able to turn those tactics on the Romans themselves. But the Romans knew that you don't parlay, you don't take, as it were, a hostage and train them up of someone or of a group of people who you absolutely have no respect for. You know,
Yeah.
they took this guy in and they attempted to sort of essentially inculcate him into Roman culture because
Hmm.
there was an opposing civilized idea
Yeah.
already present, and that they wanted to deliberately alter by his presence.
Hmm.
So it's, even though they would have, you know, people talk about how barbarian literally comes from a sort of a Greek word for, you know, baba baba, you know, baby language talking people and this kind of thing. It's
Hmm.
actually it's far more rhetorical than it is real. And
Yeah.
people like Herodotus, who like to talk about um, extraordinary ideas about people with, you know, one eye in their stomach and this kind of thing. Uh, it's almost certain that he knew it wasn't true. He just loved a good
Hmm.
story. And in the Roman mind, in the Greek mind, um, a good story, an illustrative example, was as powerful as a fact. And
Hmm.
therefore, especially post Enlightenment people looking back on this writing, sometimes tend to think that the Romans had a very sort of closed sense of what civilization was, and everything else was a barbarian. In
Hmm.
reality, it was grey, you know. And
Yeah.
actually, here on Hadrian's Wall, for example, it was never really a border; it was a frontier. Uh, there's very little evidence for the Hadrian's Wall being attacked, for example.
Hmm.
In terms of Romans soldiers coming up here, it was more or less R&R. You could come up here and spend some time looking after a section of the wall, and
Hmm.
it'd be relatively relaxing. In the winter, it got pretty cold. There were definitely letters of people being miserable, like up here. It wasn't like being on the Riviera or something. And also as well, they very deliberately shifted people around. So as you say, there were people from what is now the Netherlands. There were people from North Africa. There were people from the other extremity of the empire in this part of the world.
1 second.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm on the thing. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, my wife needed. My
Oh, it's
wife
okay.
was
If you
had
need to go and do
as you were
something,
saying. No, no, we're good. We're good.
okay.
So yeah, but yeah, the
Uh,
talking about being miserable and such at
yeah,
Adrian's
yeah,
all.
yeah. And so people, you'd have people from the other extremities of the empire, the Netherlands, North Africa, etc., stationed here, so that they were less likely to feel a sense of empathy with local people. So there was a slightly sort of cynical militaristic desire to have soldiers who would do what they're told in terms of keeping order,
Yeah.
but it was for taxation. In North Africa, they didn't need to build a wall. They had the Sahara Desert, and they could monitor caravan routes and
Hmm.
trade people coming into the imperial economic zone accordingly. But again, this idea of uh, and this is why I mentioned at the beginning, Hadrian's Wall is a psychological barrier within Britain. This idea of,
Hmm.
for example, for the English within the UK, uh, of the wall defining the edge of civilization means
Yeah.
that you also then have, not only do you have a unfortunate civilizing trope by the English, they tend to think of themselves as civilizing the rest of the country,
Hmm.
but also as well, that is to say, via the Heptarchy, the Saxons, and so on and so forth. But also as well,
Yeah.
you have this flip side of that, this unhelpful, I would argue, as a Welshman, um, this unhelpful thing of, for example, within Scotland, my granddad was Scottish, and he had a very strong sense of righteous fury against the English, you know, the Sassenach, this kind of thing, and that exists for various reasons. But one of them, I would argue, one of them is rooted um, in opposition to the idea that they're already being painted as the savages.
Yeah.
So the Scottish Enlightenment, philosophical inventions of electricity. I think a light bulb, for example, was one of the light bulbs that were invented in lots of different places, was invented in Scotland.
Mm.
Um, these people will point to those and say, "Aha, you see, so we are civilized." I suppose what I'm saying is it engenders a desire for people to
Hmm.
prove at that standard
Hmm.
when you have these artificial lines drawn. But ultimately,
Hmm.
they are very artificial, and and what it leads to are people trying to find the trappings of civilization or supremacy via other means. So the Roman
Hmm.
salute, for example, let's talk about that.
Yes,
The,
the
the
Roman
Roman
salute. Let's go into that.
the,
Yeah.
the so-called Roman salute. Supposedly, there's an image of a soldier greeting another soldier with a straightish arm on Trajan's
Hmm.
column. Trajan's column was raised in the Forum in Rome to celebrate that expansion into Dacia, into
Hmm.
Romania, and told the story of that campaign. Now, that could be one of the sources for where people think about this coming from, but really it picks up speed in the Renaissance. People
Hmm.
in Rome, in Florence, in Venice, um, coming up with ideas about the Italian past and the Pax Romana and so on and so forth, and painting stories of course, people like Julius Caesar, people like Caesar Augustus,
Hmm.
um, and these Mark Antony and so on and so forth. And having to think about, well, how do they greet people, and so they came up with the arm. um,
Yeah.
but even then, and fairly quickly after that, it became associated with uh, basically with fascist ideas. It became associated with
Hmm.
uncultured, monochrome, um, uh, controlling and overbearing sense of state identity. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's never been an honourable thing. It's never been a romantic thing.
No.
And what I find fascinating um, is that obviously a little bit like, and I remember on on January the 6th, uh, I guess actually, yeah, around that, you had this rush of people saying on social media, trying to make up excuses for who was attacking the Capitol. You know, they were saying, "Oh, it's Antifa,"
Yeah.
so on and so
Yeah.
forth. Very,
And
very
it's still
fast.
going on.
I was astonished by how quickly people would say, "Oh, look at that tattoo. That's an Antifa tattoo." No, no, that's a tattoo
Yeah.
from a computer game. What are you talking about? Um, but some of the same with some of the same speed and some of the same vehemency, you had people saying, "Oh no, it's a Roman salute,"
Yeah.
with regards to Musk.
Yeah.
But even if it is Roman, even if you want to call it Roman, it's never had positive associations. And so throwing that up in the air behind the presidential seal, I would say is an act of cultural vandalism,
It
personally.
is. Yeah.
Um, but it's fascinating that there is a desire to associate with some of these ideas that we've been talking about, some of these standards of
Hmm.
civilization via these gestures. I mean, of course, I skipped a key part of the story there, and that is that Mussolini invented it for the modern era. So he
Yeah.
picked up on this Renaissance art and other ideas, and folded it into fascism, which came from uh, a Roman concept of justice. So one of the things
Hmm.
that I don't know if you know, but one of the things that the emperor in later times in the Roman Empire was marked out by was this um, bundle of sticks in which were
Hmm.
axes, and someone would carry it behind him, and it was a symbol of his right and ability to kill or to punish,
Hmm.
and basically be judge, jury, and executioner. And that is the root of the word, that bundle of fascism.
Hmm.
This idea of strength and power in one person. Mussolini was a big fan of that,
Of
and
course. Yeah.
yeah, and then of course Hitler took it on as well. Saw something similar in terms of a gesture. The specifics of those gestures, I'm not going to go into because it's not worth it, not worth it.
Yeah. Well,
But
and it was
the
also picked up by the United States because a lot of people don't know that
oh, interesting. Okay.
our Pledge of Allegiance. Now, how I grew up with our Pledge of Allegiance, it was hand on heart,
Uh huh.
but there back before World War II, it was that gesture towards the and of course that was
Oh.
still heavily within nationalism because the United States back then was and arguably still is and it was an ethno-nationalist state for white Americans, less so now, but it still very much is cake baked within
Hmm.
everything. But back then it was very much that. I mean, of course, Henry Ford was an avid supporter of Mussolini and Hitler
Hmm.
and things like that. And things like that. So yeah, it was also in the United States too. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I was not aware of the bundle of sticks. is where
Yeah.
fascism. That's interesting to learn. That was something I was completely unaware of.
But at the same time though, it wasn't the uh, the it wasn't the focus, the core aspect of
Hmm.
the Roman world, and unlike in
Yeah,
a fascist state where
yeah,
the big guy is the focus, and the cult of personality and so on and so forth.
yeah,
Um, it's in what I suppose the question would be, why are people drawn to it? I guess what's your sense? Because obviously you guys are living at the moment with something which hasn't come out of nowhere, obviously, but with
yeah, yeah.
certainly a more obvious version of that sort of sense of, I don't know, confidence and righteousness. So
Well,
where does it
I
come
can
from?
I can say some of it is definitely so there's a joke in the United States, especially among like archaeologists and historians when you hear like somebody like who say like for example a gym bro is what we call them, somebody who's really obsessed with
Mm,
weightlifting and something like that. But it's like, oh, I love history, and you can almost guarantee that they're like obsessed with like Sparta or the ancient state of Sparta and the Roman Empire. So a lot of it
mm,
has to do with this perceived masculinity, which makes sense because Elon Musk and also other billionaires like Zuckerberg and such are obsessed with looking masculine.
mm,
Zuckerberg, for example, like tried to act like he was a tough guy and went to this UFC fight with a bunch of UFC fighters, and of course they pretty much ignored him. Look at the film; it's hilarious. He's literally just sitting there nodding his head like this.
mm. Uh-huh.
While they're
Mm-hmm.
all just walking past it. Like he's trying to act like he's part of the crowd and they're all just
Yeah.
walking
Mm-hmm.
past him. They're like, yeah, yeah, whatever. But it's definitely baked into that. It's this whole idea, and that's part of the United States like white supremacist culture in a lot of ways, and ethno nationalist culture, and you'll hear it in like Christian. People
Mm,
too. It's like, oh, the roles of men. You have to be strong, burly men. Yada yada yada. You'll
mm,
hear it in like a bunch of American right wing pundits like Charlie Kirk and other stuff that'll
mm,
be like, oh, the man has to be this, that, and the other, and so it all goes back to, I would argue, to the to toxic masculine ideas that are not actually how things worked,
mm,
in ancient Rome or ancient Sparta, of course, because of course, for example, with ancient Greek, nobody pays attention to. No, these guys pay attention to the fact that, like, for example, wrestling was, men would wrestle naked, with each other. It's like because that they would call
yeah.
that, they would use certain homophobic slurs to describe things like that. So
Well,
but it's
but also
still,
an awful lot of military training
yeah,
involved extreme
yeah,
um,
yeah.
intimacy.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's what I'm saying. And so they don't pay attention into that. And
Mm,
and a lot of it I would argue does also harken to some degree to Hadrian's Wall because
mm,
um for example, Trump's whole idea of, oh, the border wall along the border with Mexico, which isn't actually is effective,
mm,
but he I don't remember if he ever actually directly harkened to that, but I would argue it is within that sort of same vein, keeping
mm.
the civilized away from the uncivilized, even though Mexico is,
I've I've got a terrible joke for you that's
okay,
all about these sorts of walls. Okay, what what
yeah,
what did the Great Wall of China say to Hadrian's Wall?
what?
Keep your chin up.
Oh,
Of
jeez,
course, Qin being the emperor and the empire
yeah,
at the time.
yeah,
QIN. Um, but
yeah,
but yeah, as you say, yes, these walls they've had
yeah,
tremendous psychological impact on the world,
yeah,
um and I can definitely understand why. This idea of bodies as well is also a key. Uh, what's interesting though is that normally, sorry, two thoughts at once. This idea of bodies is a key fascist trope as well, actually. But what's interesting is that
yeah,
normally fascism comes first, and then the ideal of roles in society
mm,
is forced upon people. And again, Italy was a key a key uh, experiment in
Hmm.
understanding how to do this. Um, but basically, this idea of warrior culture, the role of men,
Hmm.
was brought a lot through what's the word, uniforms, basically. So people wearing more or less
Yeah.
the same sorts of clothes if they're a member of the party,
Hmm.
getting married in those clothes as well. So forcing people to
Hmm.
associate the most important days of their lives with the fascist state. But then
Yeah.
also health. So having young men who were willing to fight for the country, but also
Yeah.
young women who were frankly able to have babies. Um,
Hmm.
and again, that was it. That was encouraged via this idea of bodily health. But it's interesting how, in this instance,
Yeah.
what we've seen more recently is health and well-being being used as a way to come in the back door and talk about other ideas about statehood and this kind of thing.
See, I'm going to contradict you just very slightly
Okay,
because
yeah,
you're on the. I think you're. I agree with you for the most part. However, I will say this: is that you are forgetting that the United States was and its expansion into the North American continent
mm,
was an inspiration for people like Mussolini and Hitler. For example, Hitler's Lebensraum
hmm
was
hmm
inspired by the United States reservation system and also by the United States' Jim Crow
hmm
laws. So
hmm
I would argue that your original assumption is correct in that while the United States never quote unquote went fascist,
mm,
it's already had these ideas and and they've been here
mm.
for a while. They've been just under the surface. Um, and of course, they were the what inspired went on to eventually inspire um, uh, Mussolini, fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. I don't know necessarily how much it influenced, for example, fascist Spain, the Franco
Mm,
Franco regime or anything like
mm.
that. But I do know that it did definitely inspire those groups and their ideas of like again Lebensraum, colonizing Eastern Europe and things
Yeah,
like
it was
that.
a
So
romantic idea. Yeah, yeah.
so
Um,
so I would argue that your original assumption is correct in that it actually these ideas come first, and these ideas have already always been part of the United States. Because again, that it's there's always been this idea of, especially thanks to like after the Jacksonian era and the
hmm
Jacksonian Democrats, there's always been this idea, especially in the South and the Midwest, of white nationalism. Men are strong, men go to war.
mm,
Men this that and the other. At one point, there was this period of history called the era of good feelings, where the president at the time, President James Monroe, would oftentimes go around dressed in garb from the era of the founding. I mean, he was one of the founding fathers, but this is like 30 years after. And so,
hmm
but so he was going around dressing, it would be like if you or I went around dressed in clothing, from
From the
the
70s or something. Yeah,
70s or
yeah.
something, where it's like,
Bell
yeah,
bottom
it's not
trousers, medallion,
yeah,
big hairy chest. Yep.
but we were using it because he was using it as a propaganda piece. He was harkening back to
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
legendary past,
Yeah.
which that's part of what fascist nations do is they harken back to the mythical
Yeah.
past.
Yeah. And
So,
that's a really good point. In so much as
uh,
it's also something which it isn't just a fascist thing; it's a human thing. Um, that in so much as
yeah,
one of the things that we know about Julius Caesar, as much as he inspired people like Napoleon and so on and
mm,
so forth, he
yeah,
himself, as I think 30 something year old, might have been a bit younger.
mm,
Actually, it might even have been 33. Actually, anyway, he visited the grave of Alexander the Great
mm,
in northern Egypt, and wept. He was crying because he hadn't achieved nearly as much as Alexander the Great had at the same
yeah,
point in his life. If it was 33, of course, that's when Alexander died. I think it might have been younger though, so it might have been 20. I can't quite remember. But the point is that there's this sense that the previous
yeah,
generation, previous times were golden. Ancient Greece has
yeah,
that in spades. You have the story of Homer's Iliad, etc., being so
mm,
perfect that artists in the classical period never thought that they could ever hope to outdo the writing or the pottery or the artistry or the
yeah,
poetry of their forebears. And we have the same. We all have these sort of, and this is something which I often find myself referring to in conversations as founding mythologies.
Yeah.
And that's certainly something which, of course, the United States is explicitly
Mm,
vulnerable to, I suppose you could say, but certainly actually more healthily, you might say, explicitly coalesces around. Perhaps that's maybe a
mm,
healthier way of saying it. Because, for example, things like, growing up here in the UK, watching Hollywood movies, all you ever hear about is the bloody president and the Declaration of
yeah.
Independence.
Yeah.
You know, pledging to protect the Constitution and this kind of thing. And it's I, as an intellectual being, I find myself, admiring the ideas of those documents. But it's interesting how it's undeniably powerful, seemingly, to have this idea of a golden, slightly untouchable thing that you're all possessed of and that you're all sort
Hmm.
of working towards and looking after. But do you think that one of the issues, though, because it's interesting that you've asked me today to talk a little bit about Romans. Do you think that one of the issues here is that when you have any large group of people, is trying to find an idea that does unite them? And so, in the case of the US, it's a continent-sized country, and so
Yeah.
people are going to try and inevitably fail to find simple ideas that will describe
Yeah.
everyone at the same time. But
Hmm.
interestingly though, the reason why that applies to the Romans is that people try fail but don't know that they failed with the Romans. They think about the
Yeah.
Romans as a probably a 20 to 30 year caricature set a couple of hundred years later than it happened. That's more or less what people think Rome is. But
Hmm.
but it was vast and complex and uh, multicultural, multi-religious. It was messy. It was amazingly organized for its time, but it wasn't. Uh, it wasn't what we've just been describing in terms of a fascist state. There wasn't one way of being Roman.
No.
Just as realistically, there isn't one way of being from the United States, is there?
No. No,
But do
there
you
is
think,
not.
that's where the crisis comes along because some
Yep.
people feel the need to say, "No, no, this is American. These five
Yep.
things."
Yeah, exactly. And that
um,
is very much I would that's I would 100% agree. Very much the
hmm,
crisis is always like, well, it's always like the term red-blooded American, because
hmm,
of course that goes back to ideas that like, communists and uh also, Jewish people and any other group that was being targeted by
hmm.
the, white American majority of the United States would always say is like, they don't have
Italians at one point,
like,
yeah. Hmm,
yeah, Italians,
yeah, hmm,
Irish, Polish,
yeah,
et cetera, et cetera, and it's like red-blooded American, and so it goes back to, yeah, this is what a true American does, or to
yeah.
harken, to use another analogy from the UK, the no true Scotsman fallacy, or like
Hmm,
no true
hmm,
Scotsman is, and
hmm.
of course, I've brought that up to people in America. We're like, okay, but you're using a no true Scotsman fallacy, and they're like, you hear the Internet Explorer dial tone, start to pop
Yeah,
up,
yeah.
and
You're like, oh, I
it's
broke
like,
them.
yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, exactly. And it's always been there, because like, for example, I grew up in an you know, the ultra patriotic time period of the Iraq and the Afghanistan war right after
Hmm,
9/11 and
hmm,
such. I was in the third grade when 9/11 happened.
hmm,
Um, Something like that, so of course I very much remember very well things like that happen. Of course, after that was a stampede, like a running of the bulls sort of,
hmm,
wave of patriotism and things like that that really only until recently started to die down. And even then, it hasn't completely died down because now people are trying to bring something like that back.
hmm,
Um, so yeah, I would definitely argue that is part of it. It's the whole, there can only be one way, and and maybe not always directly, but in many ways indirectly based off of these 19th century and early 20th century ideas around fascism and the Roman Empire and things like
hmm,
that
hmm,
started being baked into it. well, and not even just that. Before then, in the 19th century, the Roman Empire was being, the United States was being compared to the Roman Empire in very different ways. Some wanted to expand like it, and then others, like John Adams, sorry, John Quincy Adams, was like, hey, maybe we should stop expanding so much because the Roman Empire overextended itself and then collapsed. And of course, that's not the whole truth because the
No.
Roman Empire hadn't expanded for quite some time, and actually, after it really arguably stopped expanding after the conquest of Dacia, and
Yeah.
even then after that, that was its height. Trajan up until uh, like the five good emperors,
Mm,
era of the five good emperors, up until that point, it was its height. And of course, even
mm.
then, it wasn't because Marcus Aurelius actually wasn't that great of an emperor and had a whole lot of crises. And actually, his son Commodus is, even though he's called a tyrant, is the one who sort of cleaned up a lot of that. And
I mean,
you know,
to be fair, Aurelius, I have a lot of time for Marcus Aurelius, not least because my name's Mark. Um,
yeah,
but no, but there was plagues, there was war, an awful lot was
yeah.
going on. He wasn't lazy.
Oh
Like,
no, no, and I don't, and I'll concede that he wasn't lazy, but my whole point is,
he was also very
like
distracted as well. He was very
he
distracted,
was
just
also
going, I
very
want to think about
distracted.
things. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because that was one of the things that like Cassius. I've heard it pronounced both ways. Feel free to correct me. I've heard it pronounced Dio and Dio, but Cassius Dio. One of the things he complained about Commodus is like Commodus ended a lot of his father's wars. Like he signed the peace treaty with the Macromantic tribes and
Mm,
the Sarmatians. And then also like pulled the Roman garrisons back from the Antonine Wall to the more defendable Hadrian's Wall, and Cassius
hmm
Dio was like, he did this. He's ending Roman yada 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 yada. And of course, it's like, well, yeah, but you were also in a financial crisis and in a plague and things like that, and he was
mm,
doing probably what saved the Roman Empire. But that's the broader point is like that even during that time that was still the height of the Roman Empire and they had stopped expanding and they still they still stayed a cohesive, or in the case of after the split into the Western and Eastern Roman empires, they stayed two cohesive entities long after their
mm,
expansion. I mean, the split of the two empires, there was no expanding going on, and even at one point there was a contraction leaving Britain.
mm,
So
mm.
that's to argue that it was the expansion that killed it is not, I would argue, not a great
They
example, but
they
it's
they
not.
they decided to leave because they got fed up of us saying bottle of water. That's what it was. They're like, well, you just
That's
say bottle of water, please, like bottle of water.
yeah, yeah, but yeah, but that still brings to the point is like that it was however untrue that that is, it was
Mm,
still being like, hey, we don't need to overextend ourselves because then we'll collapse, and then also there's the argument, the whole idea that the reason the United States is a constitutional republic, um, is because based off of the Roman Empire's republic, with of course
mm,
ignoring that
mm.
there were because like when I grew up, it was told so. Oh, after the Roman Republic fell, there were no other representative democracies or republics. And it's like okay, then later as an adult, I'm like, okay, well, what about the Republic of Milan, Republic of Venice, Republic of
Yeah.
Florence? There's a whole bunch of republics. They're not, you know, but there's that idea.
But also as well,
Yeah,
something that my lovely wife,
yeah,
she was a classicist. She studied classics at Oxford when she was a student, and
yeah.
something that she loves to remind people in and around the presidential election is that the US is not a democracy, that
Hmm.
it is a constitutional republic. Um, and
Yeah.
the idea of one person, one vote doesn't directly transfer, not least because of the colleges and this kind of thing. Um,
Yeah, well, it's also it's a representative democracy because that's
yeah,
another thing that's
yeah,
important to remember. It's like because a republic is still a subset of democracy because it does rely on votes,
yeah,
and
yeah,
rely on
yeah.
representatives, not necessarily to the same way as a direct democracy.
It ain't the thing it's been exporting.
No, no, it's not. It's not. it ain't the thing that's been exporting. Of course, that's a completely different thing, and that's a completely different subject that I
Yeah,
need
yeah.
to for a whole nother video that I do have planned. But yeah, and thinking, but yeah, exactly. But but that's still like part of the mythology. It's like, oh, we when I grew up, it's like we inherit, we became the first republic, the first representative
Yeah.
democracy since the Roman
Mm,
Empire, which of course that's not true. Again,
no.
going back to the republics of Milan and all the other republics
Yeah.
in other places, because you could also argue the Hanseatic League and the Lombard League falls within that sort of category as well.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so it's still very much baked into the United States' culture is that we're in some way the successors to the Roman Empire,
Well,
whether
and
we acknowledge it or not.
but also as
Yeah.
well, what's interesting as well is the idea of is the idea of freedom. So
Yeah.
within the Roman Empire, citizens had freedom,
Hmm.
um, but a broader sense of freedom in the US is sort of rights to, of course, bear arms, but also various other
Yeah.
rights that come with the use of things like chemicals. Oddly enough, interestingly, I've got friends who come here and go,
Really?
what you can't get your hands on this chemical? I'm like, no, it's a restricted substance, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, but that said, though, what I find fascinating is I've never heard, "Do you have a permit for that?" more than when I watch American TV.
Yeah.
Whereas here, there's an awful. We have. I suppose what I'm saying is that freedom isn't unique to the US, but
No,
also
it's not.
restrictions that come with a legal system um, are often actually forms of you might say anti-freedom, or forms of
Hmm.
curtailing freedom that people
Yeah.
become blind to because it's what they're familiar with. If you see what I mean,
Yeah.
you know.
I would. I
And
would.
so
I would agree.
yeah, so it's fascinating how um, uh, I don't know. I've heard so many people over the years, politicians especially, senators, talk about how the rest of the world doesn't have freedom. Um, but actually,
Yeah, I know.
it's interesting how so here we there are lots of ways in which we don't have certain freedoms. One of them is this land ownership. Actually, it's almost invisible in terms of I can own this house, which we do technically. We're paying the mortgage on it, but the land it's on actually belongs via a very 1,000 year, long-term lease, 1,000 year lease, belongs to an aristocrat. um, but in that sense, like, and again, therefore, a little bit like, do you have a permit for that? It's one of those things that you become inured to because if this is your version of freedom, I suppose. Um,
Mm,
but when I was remember talking to a friend who's an older friend, much older friend, whose son, who's about my age, um, was talking about how Britain has tremendous freedoms, representative democracy compared to say the EU. It was a weird conversation. It was an old one, um,
uh-huh.
and I pointed out how the Crown Estate had forced through the building of a ugly building in Newcastle City, just up the road,
Hmm.
um, breaking laws, going against local council wishes, all because someone at the palace picked up the phone and said to the Home Secretary, "We really want this to happen," and so it happened.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but but you can have that sort of sense of voting structures and governments that can give people a sense of freedom. I mean, we're slightly off topic here, but I suppose what I'm saying is it's interesting how no matter where you are, no matter what period of time you're in, normal for you is more often than not defined by what you think of as being abnormal. And I think
Yeah.
the same also goes for when we look back in time. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and therefore, as well, we tend to start thinking of commonalities where possibly there weren't as well. Hence, people feeling a kinship with the Roman Empire that probably is more abnormal than they want to
Yeah.
acknowledge. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, like, I mean, we all, going back on something we mentioned earlier with Boudica and uh, Britain and such, Britannia, like we all wear trousers. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Why are you wearing trousers? You're freaking me out, man. But
Well,
then, but
that
then,
was so.
within a
Yeah,
couple of decades, though, they were wearing trousers and shoes. They weren't wearing open-toed sandals because
I know.
your toes will freeze off. You know, like,
Well, and that's another. Well, and that's another thing. You see that you always see in movies Rome looking like the every like for example the Roman army even in like later movies like for example in uh uh the Clive Owen King Arthur movie, where it's
mm,
like where he's a Roman general. Which, to be fair, I do think that I think most scholars agree that the figure who inspired Arthur was probably a Roman general, but um, who he was regardless. I'm not getting into that because that's not my specialty, but I do know that is a pretty good
I know
consensus.
lots of
Like,
medievalists who will argue with you all day on that. So yeah, just
yeah, well,
yeah,
yeah, but and I know that too. But my point is, like that's not out of the realm of reality. Of course, most of the video that movie is for example, it's way out of time. But the Roman army in there looks like the Roman army, like say you know during like after like the Marian reforms. It look they're
yeah,
wearing the helmets with the big feather like thing on the crest on the back and such. And it's like
yeah.
okay, but at that point in time, they wouldn't have looked like that at all. They would have looked very
No, but
different. Or,
there's a really good
you
reason for that though, and that is that prop houses can't carry that type of armor.
yeah,
They
and that's fair, and that's
don't.
and that's fair. But it's still part of that. Or like you look at like that mini series
Mm,
about the druids mini series about Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul. They look like
mm,
that too. It's like, and again, they wouldn't have
yeah,
looked like that at that period of time, or
mm,
any number of things. But that's what you see. You
mm,
see it's that look, and that's what people expect.
mm.
So it is
So,
it is
so
what it is.
is it as ever a matter of what we spend so much of our time doing and telling people that history is far more complicated than
Yeah.
perhaps they think it is?
I
Like,
would. I think that's a good point to kind of end on. Is like history is complicated. Like unfortunately, history is beyond complicated. It's not a black and white picture. It's not a
mm,
singular picture. Rome, like as you said, like Rome existed for around us, like as an entity, like a political entity. Uh, I mean, it still
more than a
exists as a
thousand
political
years. Yeah.
entity, yeah, but 1,000 years,
Mm,
and that happens a lot. Well, like the United States in 200 and some odd years, our clothing and our cultures, our cars, our building structures have changed significantly. Firearms,
yeah.
swords, and for whatever reason, everyone is stuck on that one little period in time of the Roman Empire where they looked a specific way. Oh, and of course, nothing was ever painted. Everything is just plain
Oh
white
yeah.
marble.
All the
Never
statues are white.
mind that
Yeah.
they,
Yeah. I suppose.
like
Okay. Okay. What one something more interesting than just history is complicated? Maybe
yeah,
a question to leave maybe your
yeah,
wonderful audience with is
yeah,
how do you think people, let's say in 1,000 years, will imagine life today?
yeah.
What will be the stereotype? I wonder. What will be the
I
characterization?
wonder.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do wonder. That is the question. What will or Western civilization in general, like what will be the stereotype?
Yeah.
What will be the idea of what the United States looked like, or versus what the UK looked like? What will be the
Yeah.
stereotype of garb? And I think that's a good question.
And
What?
and I suppose will some of the crucial differences that we think of today be even
Yeah,
acknowledged in the future? So, for example,
yeah,
yeah, I get just been talking about Romans. People always think about the
mhm,
military when it comes to Romans. It's
yeah,
always soldiers. They always look as you've been describing with
yeah,
the crests and the big shields and doing the testudo and all this kind of stuff.
yeah,
Um, so I wonder if actually the equivalent will be a jarhead soldier in a desert somewhere. You know what I mean?
yeah,
I wonder if that's how
yeah,
people, and they'll just imagine that everyone was walking around wearing military uniform. You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I will say. if somebody makes a Monty in the future makes a Monty Python-esque movie and they make a joke like similar to the biggest dickest joke, I will
Yeah.
be, you know,
Yeah.
I will be happy. That
Yeah.
would be great, you know, just have a jarhead come on, you
Yeah.
know, and set, you know,
He's a very
like,
good
oh,
friend of
you
mine
know, this is,
because
yeah, yeah, that's like, yeah, exactly. But yeah,
there's
but I think
something
that's a
funny.
good, yeah. But
Mm.
but I think that's a good point to bring up. It's like, what will the stereotypes be? I mean, because arguably, you know, we already have for like the Old West and also, you know, Victorian England, you know, we already have these sort of stereotypes of how people look. Never mind, they didn't always look like that, you
Yeah.
know, but that's what they have. People always think like, say, you know, a Lord Byron esque look for, you know, the UK, and people have
Hmm.
like John Wayne or Wyatt Earp or,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
George Washington for the United States.
Yeah.
So
And then for later Victorians, it's interesting how a Victorian kid is always a dirty street urchin.
yeah,
That
that's
sounds
another
like they're from the southeast, sort of.
yeah, and
Please, governor.
that's another one. Yeah, and that's another one that's still pretty, you know,
Yeah.
around a lot, even in the US, you know, is
Yeah.
the dirty street urchin. So yeah,
Yeah.
so I think that's so let's leave that with the viewers. Like think about it, you know, what
Yeah.
will the stereotypes be in the future uh, you know, for us and think why that's maybe, you know, in the modern era, maybe not the best idea to compare, think of, look at only the stereotypes of, say, the Roman Empire that were,
Mm.
in many ways, as Mark here talked about, created by fascist regimes, you
Mm.
know, like fascist Italy under Mussolini. So
Mm.
with that, thank you, Mark, for coming on
You're very welcome. It's been
and
fun.
helping explain all of this and sort of leaving these thought experiments for people that I think are going to be very helpful in the future to people. Um, and you know, everyone remember to for one thing, if y'all want to see us talk about other things in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section.
Hmm. Hmm.
Remember to like, share, and subscribe to uh, Mark's YouTube channel, Archaeosoup. And are you on Instagram or any other social media?
You can find me Instagram, TikTok. Those are the two main places,
Yeah.
along with YouTube.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, Instagram and TikTok, of course, in the
Yeah.
United States, TikTok may no longer be a thing, but you know,
Oh yeah.
that's a whole nother thing. But also, you know, remember to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Archeo Viking, which is now finally monetized. So that's cool.
Hey, well done. Well done.
Yeah. Yes. But yeah, so with that, and then you all have a good day, and thank you for watching. And thank you again, Mark, for coming on. So.
You're very welcome. Very welcome.